So what games come to your mind when you think of the most influential games that had the biggest effect in the world of independent video game developments? There are some answers people may give, like Minecraft, Braid, maybe even Spelunky. And one common aspect among these games specifically is that at least at some points, these games were all being developed by one person. And nowadays, we see that type of thing more often as indie game development becomes more easily accessible. Undertale, Balatro, Iconoclast, Return to the Obra Dinn, Nightmare of Decay, Fight and Rage, all of these games solo developed by their respective creators, with maybe a little bit of help here and there. And I'm not pointing out these more modern examples as a way to take away from the significance of such an achievement, but rather to highlight how far indie game development has come after all these years. And I think one major player in that space that should always be recognized is Cave Story. Arguably one of the most, if not the most, influential indie game to ever come out, simply for the fact that it was an amazing game made by one person, showing the world that it was possible for somebody with the drive and passion to create a great game without the need of a big studio or massive budgets. Cave Story came out 20 years ago, and it has definitely stood the test of time. Its quality still vastly exceeds that of modern games, and I wouldn't be surprised to see somebody today still say that it's their favorite game. Daisuke Amaya, also known as Pixel, would begin developing Cave Story sometime in the very late 90s. He'd be developing pretty much everything from the ground up, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that either. During a GDC conference back in 2011, he'd showcased some of the tools he used for his game's developments. He created the engine that would run Cave Story, as well as created the music production software that he'd use to make music for it. You can actually still download this music program today if you wanted to. Eventually, Cave Story would reach completion and would be released online in 2004 as freeware, making it available for anybody to try out if they wanted to. Pixel wasn't very concerned about making money, and more wanted to make sure as many people got to experience the world that he created, and that's exactly what happened. Prior to the release of Cave Story, the indie scene at the time didn't look close at all to what it is now, but there were still indie games that came out before it. Zun, the creator of Touhou, had already released 10 Touhou games by this point. Hell, even Pixel created a couple games before releasing Cave Story. But Cave Story was just different. It captured the attention of Western audiences with its unique style and polish that you'd only expect to see from Nintendo at the time. On top of the fact that it was made by one person, it would go on to inspire many of the major players in the indie scene. And many of those people would go on to help push the indie scene to take those next couple steps towards what we know it as today. In short, Cave Story walked so that FNAF could run. So what does this have to do with Momodora? Well, RDN, an at the time amateur indie game developer from Brazil, was one of those people who was very much inspired by the work done by Pixel. Some of the earliest posts you can find from RDN are from a Cave Story-centered forum called Cave Story Tribute Site Forums. At the time, he simply went by the name of Golid Me Ein. A funny story, when I was looking into when Pixel started developing Cave Story, I came across this post made by RDN. And I swear to God, I wasn't looking for that either. I was searching for information about Cave Story. It was all research centered around Cave Story, and I came across this post, which I thought was really funny. And in a way, it really demonstrates how much of a fan RDN was and still is of Cave Story. He was pretty active on this forum and would share his interest in the development of Cave Story and talk about his theories around the game's lore. At one point, he even dedicated a section of an old website of his to archiving information regarding the beta version of Cave Story. Anyway, a year later in 2009, he'd move on from the Cave Story forums and would begin posting more often on the TigSource forums, a site dedicated to allowing individuals to share their games with other community members who share the same interests in indie game development. Anyone who's an indie game enthusiast would likely already be aware of this site. This forum is actually where games like Minecraft, Fez, and even Spelunky would make their first appearances online. RDN's first post on this site would be a call to any musicians who might be interested in producing a soundtrack for a game he was working on. When asked to give a synopsis on this project, he described its premise as being about a girl sent by a moon goddess whose duty is to save the moon's light from a darkness force threatening to take it away. The loss of this light would cause a sort of eclipse, When the moon stops shining, every life force is set to death. This game would be known as Moonchild. And in this post, RDN would also find his musician, J.W. Hendricks. At the time, J.W. was busy working on another game's soundtrack, but would ultimately hop on board to produce the music for Moonchild. Any archive of the development of Moonchild is largely gone. There was a dev blog dedicated to it at one point, but very little information about this blog exists anymore. What is known though is that Moonchild seemed to be an extremely ambitious project. RDN would describe how the game would have several arcs that would have their own stories and characters. It would have a focus on exploration and action, where the player would complete quests and puzzles. It honestly sounded like an amazing game. However, development wasn't going as smoothly as RDN would have liked. Alongside these updates of new additions to the game, he'd also expressed a lack of motivation, and how the game might just not be that fun, afraid of the possibility that he might have tricked himself into thinking that it was. On top of that, there were influences in his real life that likely affected the development of the game, but despite that, only 2 months later, we'd get our first trailer for Moonchild, featuring the music produced by J.W. Hendricks. Any information related to Moonchild beyond this point isn't clear. RDN wouldn't often talk about it on the TickSource forums, and it would be a while before we got our next updates. But in the meantime, RDN would spend more time interacting with the community of the forum. His activity on these forums mostly revolved around providing feedback to other developers and helping out whenever he felt like he could. And let me just say that exploring these old threads really gives you a sense of the community that existed at the time. It seems so tight-knit, with familiar names often popping up in several threads. It's like a small town where everybody kind of knew each other. One frequent visitor to the site around this time was Mr. Pedunkian, who you might know as being the creator of the Merry Gear Solid series, The Underside, and being a vital contributor to the 1.4 and 1.5 updates to Stardew Valley, and currently is developing a life sim game called Sunkissed City. Mr. Pedunkian back in April of 2010 would announce via a TickSource thread an idea for a community event called Action 52 Owns. Action 52 is an NES game that released back in 1993, which consisted of 52 games, all of which were of poor quality. The idea behind Action 52 Owns was that the TickSource community members would assign themselves a game from the Action 52 library and remake it into something that would actually resemble a game. RDN participated in this event and decided to remake Bubblegum Rosie, renaming it Bubble Girl Rosie. This game would also feature music produced by J.W. Hendricks and Annihilator Beta. Just as a side note, I'm pretty sure Annihilator Beta is PKBT. It took me a while to figure that one out, and I spent way more time than I want to admit trying to track down this Annihilator Beta person, but it turned out to be PKBT. At least I'm pretty sure it's them. The title screen art was drawn by Easy Nam, who would actually go on to help out a little bit on the demo of Undertale. The game would feature RDN's cute chibi art style, as well as generally be a very difficult game, which is also pretty common for all of his works. One thing I really like about the games he makes is how he puts extra details in some places. Like how Rosie gets pushed back when you fire bubbles, or how she runs out of breath if you blow too many bubbles without any breaks, or how her hair trails behind her when you fall, or even how the enemies refuse to fight you because they're just too cold. But if you're a real die-hard Bubblegum Rosie fan, then you can try out Classic Mode. It makes the game a bit more faithful to the original, complete with spikes that do absolutely nothing. So with that little detour out of the way, we'd soon get an update for Moonchild. In this post where JW advertises his work, he'd mentioned that he produced music for Moonchild, but that it was indeed cancelled. And in this thread titled, "So what are you working on?" we'd see RDN make a post where an image was presumably attached. It doesn't exist now, but the text mentions that he should make a devlog for this game. JW would respond to this post, asking if this was the small Moonchild game he was working on, to which RDN would confirm yes, that it's a spiritual remake of Moonchild, without the exploration element and more focus on action. And only a couple days later, RDN would indeed create a devlog for this game, introducing this new project as Momodora. At the time, the game was still in early development, and RDN intended for people to provide feedback to help improve on the game further. And even though he'd explained that Moonchild was scrapped and that Momodora was taking its place, that's not necessarily the only reason why Momodora would exist. In the grand scheme of things, Moonchild was just another step towards the creation of Momodora. Much like Moonchild, there were other games that were being developed by RDN that were similarly scrapped, but the ideas, features, and even characters weren't completely thrown away. In a recent interview with RDN, he'd be asked where the initial idea for Momodora came from. He'd explain that he's been making and giving up on games for years leading up to Momodora. That he'd use the scraps from all these games and it would all accumulate into the creation of the first Momodora game, a game that was born out of reused assets from a massive Metroidvania game. Something he shared recently was another cancelled project called Caramel. It's not clear when it was meant to be released, but I suspect it was going to come out after Momodora 1. Of course, that ultimately wouldn't happen, but this game would have had you playing as a character that would eventually be introduced as the main character of Momodora 2. Just another example of when RDN cancels projects, not everything goes to waste. Anyway, now that Momodora 1 was officially available for everybody to try out, he'd be looking for feedback to improve on the game. Lots of people would lend their support and would actually become longtime contributors to the Momodora series. Thurns was here, and they'd be around for basically every game since. PKBT, who I've mentioned in my last video as being a programmer for Momodora 4, was here too. Another unexpected person who's also here is Tuyo Chang, who you might know better as Tuyoki or Temi Chang, one of the lead artists for Undertale, and she's pretty much been involved in every Momodora game to some extent, mostly related to art stuff. For Momodora 1, she went ahead and drew this adorable title screen art for the game. So with that whole introduction out of the way, let's finally jump into the game. So here we are on the title screen. As I already said, this art was drawn by Temi Chang, and the music is by J.W. Hendricks. I think RDN really wanted something reminiscent to Cave Story when it came to the music. I believe JW even used the same program that Pixel had created for Cave Story. I'm actually really into the music of Momodora 1. I'll admit though that I do distinctly remember playing this for the first time and being kind of on the music. I wasn't really a huge fan, but it did quickly grow on me, and now it holds a very special place in my own personal tier list of the best Momodora soundtracks. So we only really have two options to start playing the game. We can start a new game, or we can select the time attack option. Time attack does exactly what you may think. An in-game timer keeps track of how quickly you can reach the end, and originally that's all it was. But later on it was updated to reduce the amount of health that Dora had, which does effectively make it the game's hard mode. Besides that though, there's really no difference. Also, the pointer used on the menu options is a fresh spring leaf, which of course by this point likely didn't hold any real significance beyond just being an interesting aesthetic. With the added context from Momodora 4, it means that our main character for this story has since upgraded from their standard maple leaf. And speaking of story, this game takes place 400 years after the events of Momodora 4, and it opens up with this short little intro that basically explains our character's entire motivation. Of course, at the time, RDN didn't have the whole backstory planned out that we'd get from Momodora 4, but retroactively, it makes the introduction somewhat familiar, as it references Koho, which of course was what Lun Village was renamed to, in honor of Kaho, who of course sacrificed herself to save Lun Village. This intro also references the ritual sacrifices. Of course though, those details aren't too important to the immediate story presented to us. This story is about a girl named Isadora Doralina, or Dora for short, who had lost her mother to the sacrifices that would take place in Coho. Dora refuses to accept the loss of her mother, so she travels to the shrine called Terra Altar in search of some sort of sacred item that supposedly has the power to bring her mother back to life. Although it's a very simple story, it's probably my favorite of all the Momodora games. And one part as to why I like this story is due to the retroactive context added. We just came from a story about a mysterious priestess who sacrificed her life to save a world that she never got the chance to experience for herself. She lost friends and family through her journey, and in the end, it was because of her sacrifices that a story like Dora's could exist. Dora's story isn't nearly as important to the world of Momodora like Kaho's, but it's a more personal story about a girl who loves her mother so much that she wasn't willing to accept the reality that she was no longer alive. For some people, an experience like that could feel like a world-ending tragedy. And if there's one thing I love about RDN's work, it's the tragedy that he loves to inject into his stories. One of the first things you might notice about the game upon starting is how familiar it looks to Cave Story. I should mention right now that Cave Story might come up quite a few times during this section. This game is practically a Cave Story fan game, which honestly wasn't uncommon at the time with indie games. The environments, Dora's design, the gameplay, it's all very Cave Story infused. Of course, that's not a bad thing, but it did mean that this game didn't really have an identity of its own yet. The leaf, which of course would become iconic to the series, was introduced here, and some enemies here would make reappearances through the later games. The Bachman is the very first enemy you see, and you'll notice a prominent use of giant eyeballs in this design, and for most of the designs to be honest. RDN actually responded to comments about why the enemies have giant eyes, but he'd simply explain that the reason for it was just that he felt like it, that he likes one-eyed enemies, and that perhaps it was just a Zelda inspiration. But he mentions that he probably won't ever elaborate as to why they have these prominent eyes. And now, nearly 15 years later, I don't think he ever has. Besides the enemies, the leaf weapon, and our main character, those are pretty much the only major aspects I would stick around for the future Momodora games. Everything else is just sort of Cave Story lights. Even these spikes look kind of like Cave Story spikes. It wouldn't be until Momodora 2 where I feel like the game managed to establish more of its own identity. Many parts of that game would further define what Momodora is, and those aspects would become staples moving forward. But you have to cut this game a little bit of slack because it was the first in the series. Although to be honest, I don't think it needs to be given too much leeway, because even though aesthetically it might not set itself apart too much, the gameplay I think really carries the experience. RDN really wanted the level design to be the best aspect of this game, and I think he succeeds at that. Similar to games like Castlevania, you don't want to just run blindly into areas without taking into consideration the enemy composition and placement on the map. Your focus might be on one enemy, but sometimes you'll have to switch your attention to another depending on the scenario. There are many examples where you can see where real thought was put into this part of the game, and it creates a challenging experience that honestly might be too tough for some newer players. Throughout the game, we'll be able to find collectibles as well. These collectibles sometimes add some lore to the world, sometimes they're references, and sometimes they're probably just additions RDN made just because he thought it would be fun to add. This first one is a bird statue, but I don't think it holds really any more significance beyond just being a bird statue. If it is a reference to something, I don't know what it is. Shortly afterwards, Dora will find her first gun. Oh, also, this game has guns. What I suspect to be a remnant of the Cave Story influence is the addition of guns. They'd be replaced by other forms of ranged weaponry in all the future Momodora games, like Kaho's bow. But the first gun Dora will find is the ESP gun, which unfortunately makes the leaf almost immediately obsolete, as the guns in this game are basically just better than the leaf in every way. Lots of moments where you might have been careful with timing and positioning might not be as challenging when you have what is effectively an infinite range leaf. Still, even though the guns are significantly stronger, the game does a good job of incorporating lots of verticality, which does serve to keep the game difficult since Dora can't aim upwards. Funnily enough, there were some people on the thread for Momodora that requested the ability to shoot upwards, but RDN would be hesitant to add this feature, stating that he liked the limitation that he put on the player, but was open to adding it if the demand was there. Personally, I'm glad he didn't. The game was clearly designed to not allow the player that level of freedom. If it was, then I'd assume RDN would have put it into the game to begin with. If we watch that trailer footage again, you'll notice that it's clearly implemented in Moonchild, and I think from that, we can tell that it was a deliberate choice from RDN to not include that feature. The next collectible we can find is a golden flower, which was apparently worn by the sun priestess Mamakia. Mamakia is a reference to the moon goddess of Inca mythology, named, well, Mamakia. Is it deep Momodora lore, or is it just an ironic collectible that RDN included because he thought it was funny? To be honest, both are very likely. Traveling deeper into this cave will lead us to another collectible found within the Tetris room. You might be wondering, why do they call it the Tetris room? And to that I say, what are you, a fucking idiot? It's because the blocks look like Tetris blocks. PKBT was actually the one who made this room, and I believe it was the only addition that they made for this game. Who would have known at the time that PKBT would have become a major programmer for basically every Momodora game moving forward. You'd think that this series is what PKBT would be best known for, but they actually have a site that covers some of their other games that they've worked on. From here we can find a project that arguably is more important to their portfolio than Momodora. The collectible we can find in the Tetris room is the Moonflower. The Moonflower and Golden Flower do make reappearances in later games, but beyond that, aren't very important. A small detail I like in this next area is that you can see Dora's breath, since it's meant to be cold. We saw this detail in Momodora 4 as well, but I just think it's funny how even way back in Momodora 1, RDN still bothered to do this little extra bit of flair. We'll find our first sub-weapon, the boomerang, in this next room. I like this room quite a bit because it does showcase RDN trying to teach the player some rules without directly telling them. This crystal would prompt the player to use the boomerang to hit objects out of your reach. And I think people's initial interpretation of this is to use it against this Bachman over here. If you throw it at the Bachman, not only can you kill the Bachman, but in the process, you'll also hit this pink crystal sitting over here next to him, which opens the path forward. Just a cool little moment of clever game design that I wanted to highlight. Anyway, let's move on to the next location, and I quite like the music in this area a lot too. This area also introduces these floating enemies called Oyu, which is simply the Brazilian Portuguese translation of eye. These enemies really creep me out, mainly due to their erratic movement of their tendrils. It literally gives me chills if I focus too much on that. It's just kind of, spooky looking. In this branching path, we can find our next gun. And look, it's called Kars Gatling. Once again, at the time, RDN didn't have the history of Momodora 4 planned out yet, but with the knowledge we know now, it seems like in those 400 years, Kars Kingdom might have recovered, and now they're producing weaponry like this. Further in this cave, we can find a hairpin. Its description reads that it's a hairpin worn by the Holy Maiden from the Eos tribe. Or Eos tribe? I don't know. Although it wouldn't be uncommon to meet plenty of visitors from other lands and tribes in later games, we never really learn anything from the Eos tribe. This is the only time they're referenced, as far as I could tell. But still, it's just another extra bit of lore. Speaking of lore, the next item we can find is a shell fruit. Remember this thing from the end of Momodora 4? It mentions what I said in that video about how they fell from the sky. 1,000 of them, more specifically, and apparently they're very delicious too, despite the odd shape. Pretty funny because I like to think that RDN added this item and gave it this description without much thought, only for it to become one of the most powerful things in the world of Momodora. Although, not much would be done with that new level of importance, but I still think it's cool. We'll enter our next location soon, and once again, I love the music that accompanies it. It's more subdued and dreamy compared to the music used for previous locations. which I think is a really good contrast with the more cold and industrial theme of this area, which is also in stark contrast to the more natural cave formations we were mainly exploring in the previous levels. The cave walls are no longer visible in the background, it's just been replaced by these squares and tracks. The rocky formations we'd often traverse on have been mined away and replaced with these metal platforms, which makes the floor more even and flat. And as I said, it's quite the divergence from the more uneven and somewhat chaotic natural cave formations we've been exploring. Even some of the Bachmen have been turned into these things called vent men, essentially transformed into machines, and this might be me reading too much into it, but during the credits roll at the end of the game, Ventman is the only character in the whole game that has their name written entirely in caps. It makes me think that Ventman isn't really a name of its species, but more the name of its model. Another part of this level that feels very mechanical is our next gun. Originally, I planned to just make fun of this because it just seems so silly, but as I thought more about the theme of the level, it feels like this just makes sense. All the guns we've collected from this cave so far have all been weird magic space guns, you know? The ESP gun shoots these slow-moving waves of energy. The Karst Gatling gun shoots a barrage of Mega Man pellets. But here, in this area that's covered in so much metal it blocks out the walls of the cave, we find a real gun. It works like a real gun too. It's instant. It does the most damage in the game. Ardian mentioned on the thread that he was going to implement a 6-bullet limit to the gun before you would need to reload, but that was never added to any version of the game as far as I know. I kinda wish he did though, just because I feel like it would have been more fitting to have a realistically functioning revolver in this area. I really have no idea if any of this was at all intentional, and more likely than not, it was more of a happy accident that these things happened to line up with a pattern I made up in my own head. All of that aside though, it is pretty funny to see Dora running around with a revolver. Even though we never use guns again in future Momodora games, this actually wouldn't be the last time we'd see a Shrine Maiden holding a pistol. The next collectible we can find is Purpley's Crown, a crown once blessed with the power of life, previously atop of a purple tower. Obviously a reference to one of Ardian's previous games, Purple Tower. Kinda makes me wonder if that's where some of the other collectibles come from as well. The bird statue might be from another one of Ardian's games. The next location will find another sub-weapon, but this time it's a shield. It'll spawn 4 orbs that surround Dora, and they're capable of blocking projectiles as well as hurting enemies that come in contact with them. There's a pretty interesting secret in this level if you jump past these spikes and into this pit. These are fake spikes, so they shouldn't hurt you. Down here we can find 2 characters hanging out. The dog with the hat is named Vodka, and I really have no idea if he's meant to be a reference to something. I want to say it might be like a little character that was meant to represent RDN, maybe? But that's just me guessing. This other character, on the other hand, though, I know lots about. This is Yoki, or rather, they were known as Yoki. Let me explain. Yoki was an original character made by Timmy Chang, way back in 2006, and probably even before that. And as you may expect, the character looked significantly different. Over the years, Yoki would change appearance and evolve quite a bit until eventually we'd reach something that looks familiar to what this sprite is referencing. Beyond that, she has continued to evolve and has even been used for several animations that Temmie has created. Around 2018, Yoki would be split into 2 different characters. This Yoki is now simply referred to as Yoke, while this other Yoki is still named Yoki, but with only one eye. And Yoki would even go on to star in her own game, made by Temmie Chang. Lately though, it doesn't seem like Temmie has drawn Yoke or even Yoki in a while. So at the moment, they're missing, and if you have any information regarding their whereabouts, then be sure to inform the police as soon as possible. Anyways, sorry about that little tangent, but learning about Yoki and how she evolved was pretty interesting to me, and I just wanted to share that. One thing I did discover while researching Yoki though, was this drawing of Dora Temmie made. I never knew that little hairpin was meant to be a fish. That's pretty cute. Anyway, we have one more secret down here in the water, in the form of a squid hat, a reference to Ika-chan, a game developed by Pixel prior to Cave Story's release. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this area, and now we can move on. During our transition to the next location, we'll come across this crystal asking us if we're familiar with the Konami code. For those unfamiliar, the Konami code was simply a sequence of inputs a player could make that would give them access to some sort of item or secrets. Konami used this code quite often in their games, and has become so recognizable that you can even find the code being used in other non-Konami developed games. Inputting the sequence here will grant you a secret collectible item called the Pause Fairy, a fairy that only appears in the pause screen and is known for her useless advice. There's another collectible we can find through a similar manner if we simply hit F12 3 times. This earns us a 2-year-old doll, a very stupid doll, some idiot must have made it. And before we go to the next area, there's just one more collectible here before we move on. Past this wall, we can find a time egg. This is supposed to be the time egg from Chrono Cross, or at least I think it's referencing the one from Chrono Cross. The time egg was in Chrono Trigger, but it looks more like a normal egg in that game. In this next area, we'll find the Chaser Bazooka. It fires extremely weak missiles, but they're very effective at locking onto enemies. As I said, it's very weak and does so little damage that the time it takes to kill some enemies takes so long that I usually don't bother using it myself, although it is handy when you want to kill a group of smaller, weaker enemies. The next collectible we can find is this white mask. Apparently you can feel a strange aura coming from it. No idea what it's referencing. Again, you never know what these things could be when it comes to RDN. It could be a reference to some anime, game, whatever, or he could just add it for fun, for no reason at all. He does that sometimes. he really just wants to keep everybody on their toes when it comes to this type of stuff. Kind of like this next collectible, which is a love letter. This has to definitely be something he added just because it was funny. I don't know who's sending love letters via monster-infested caves, but I mean, if it was meant for Dora, then I suppose it worked out in this case. And here we are, at the entrance of the final location of the game. We can find a memory journal of a previous traveler, which makes sense given the rumors of the sacred item that apparently exists in this place. This crystal also outright tells us, this is the final destination. There is no turning back now. Relative to all the areas we've explored previously, this place is pretty spooky. One of the first things you might see are these bones, and this weird ghostly face stuck inside this block. Not too far ahead, we'll even see a skeleton hanging from a chain, or perhaps a noose. That's pretty unfortunate. On the bright side, the music here is pretty fantastic. I haven't really talked about J.W. Hendrix just yet, but I guess I'll take this time to talk about him a little bit. It seems J.W. has moved on from music production. It honestly might have been more of a hobby for him at the time, but Momodora was one of the last projects he worked on. In between the time he jumped on board to make the soundtrack for Moonchild and the release of Momodora, he'd contribute a song to a collaborative musical effort to raise money for cancer called Songs for a Cure. This was his submission. After these projects, it seems he moved on from music, and at some point would invest more time into his passion for photography, photojournalism, and writing. He'd go on to extensively cover various protest, labor movements, and other public demonstrations. And another big passion for JW is film. Notably, he extensively covered the Writers Guild of America strike, where he hoped, through his photography, would help people recognize the humans behind the art that produced value for an industry that didn't seem to care for them, using their art simply as products to achieve financial success while ignoring the people who were behind the art in the first place. Just this year, JW would go on to be recognized by the Hollywood Creative Alliance for his efforts during the Writers Guild of America strike.
Hi everyone, I'm JW. God, a lot of my heroes are here tonight. Really quick, organized movements are one of the best tools that we as ordinary citizens have to fight for a better way of life, to fight for a society that puts people over profit, and too often these movements are forgotten. So thank you, HCA, for honoring these strikes, and thank you to everyone who ever showed up to the picket lines, including other unions, teachers, animators, nurses, flight attendants, Starbucks workers, strippers, hotel workers, IATSE, Teamsters, and more, and Jerry, who is there every day at Warner Brothers. My God. Cinema is my life, so it was an honor, the highest honor of my life, of our lives, to join you all in this fight. So thank you so much, everyone.
JW seems like an overall nice guy, and despite not being involved in the future Momodora games, he'd still remember to congratulate RDN with the release of Momodora 4, and generally seems very happy to see RDN doing as well as he is. I don't know if JW is aware, but his music would definitely continue to live on in future Momodora games. His title theme, for example, is still being used in some form in every game. Jumping forward just a moment, we can even hear it in Momodora 2's title theme. It may not sound like it at first, but if you slow it down just a bit, and this is the case for Momodora 3 and even 5. It's really touching to see how future composers for the series still made sure to keep that original theme alive in some way. But I think it's about time we got back to Momodora 1 and finally finish it off, because this area leads right into the final room of the game. The path behind you gets blocked off, and we'd only need to move a little bit further into the room before a demon would appear before Dora. She seems somewhat surprised that Dora has made it this far, but she'd introduce herself as Lamia, the underworld queen. She taunts Dora for believing in a stupid legend about fooling death, that those who seek to fool death will only meet eternal doom themselves. That probably explains the skeletons we saw earlier. So if Lamia is to be believed, then this whole journey was for nothing. But this demon isn't interested in letting Dora go. Dora's only choice at this point is to fight Lamia. Interestingly, Lamia would pull out a fresh spring leaf that looks identical to Dora's. That makes me think that perhaps Lamia was once a shrine maiden like Dora, or even Kaho. And speaking of fresh spring leaf, this is actually when it comes in handy. Lamia can't be hurt by the weapons you've collected here. She can only be hurt when you successfully reflect this giant ball of energy she throws at you. She'll also try to reflect it back at you, but it's like tennis. You gotta keep playing this game with her until she can't keep up. After you do that a couple times, she'll retreat and instead she'll have this Kirby boss fight you in her place. This thing's name is Chiyoko. It's definitely a lot more threatening than Lamia, but although its attacks look a bit scary, they're limited in range, so as long as you keep your distance, you should be fine for the most parts. It should be obvious that the giant red eyeball is its weak point. It's also vulnerable to weapons besides the leaf, so you can pull out the iron and light him up. After a couple shots, it reveals its true form, which ironically is a lot more cute looking than its previous form. That being said, this monster becomes a bit more threatening. This time, it'll periodically send projectiles across the entire floor, which means you gotta make sure you stay on higher ground. But besides that, it's pretty much the same boss fights. Feed him a bit more lead, and he should go down relatively quickly. After destroying Chiyoko, Lamia would reappear, and out of frustration, would ask Dora if her will to see her mother was really that strong. Surprisingly, Lamia would allow Dora to see her mother, but tells her that she'll regret her decision to do so. Lamia would vanish away, and a couple moments later, we'd see Dora's mother appear, but only as a ghostly projection. She'd tell Dora that it's probably hard to see her in such a state, but assures her that it's admirable what Dora has done for her. But she also tells her that she can't come back to life, that she was chosen as one of the holy sacrifices for the eventual recreation of this world. She explains that she can't disobey the will of the gods, that it had to be done and nothing can change that back. She tells Dora that she's sorry, that she understands the pain that she's going through. She reminds Dora that she loves her, and as a final gift to her, she'll teleport Dora out of the cave. Dora, heartbroken, would look down and away from her mother before she's transported back to the entrance of Terra Altar. And that's the end of Momodora 1. As I said before, it's my favorite story of all these Momodora games. It's simple, yes, but these more personal stories about loss of loved ones and the effect it has on the people and the fallout of it all really makes me feel something. And I know I'm filling in the gaps quite a bit there. I mean, Dora never speaks, but that's just what I get out of it. And that's sort of part of the reason why I like the way Ardian leaves his stories so open. He said himself that he wouldn't be so pretentious to say his goal is to teach anyone anything through his games, that his goal was always to make a fun game that plays well and has design elements that are appealing to him. There is of course meaning in the stories, like the story of Momodora, Reverie Under the Moonlight, being about a sacrifice to save many people, even though they don't even know you. But that players can get their own interpretation or ideas out of his games, that he thinks it's great if you can get something out of it that's important to you. Although when it comes to gameplay, I'll have to admit that Ardian might not like as much as I do. Recently, when asked if Momodora 1 and 2 would ever come to Steam, he'd explained that he wouldn't want to put them on Steam in their current state due to them not meeting his standard of quality anymore, that they haven't aged as well as he wishes they did. At the moment, he's more concerned about working on new projects rather than trying to rework an old game from over 10 years ago. Which is fair. I will say though, I think a full-on remake from the ground up of Momodora 1 and even 2 would be pretty cool. Who knows? Maybe one day. Take care, guys.